Hello, class, and welcome back to Lesson 8 on genre. In Part 2, we will briefly discuss genre history. Of course, genre has been with us in the movies since their inception. Movies have been classified into genres very distinctly as early as silent short films. And certainly by the heyday of Hollywood in the 1930s, genres were quite distinct, both in how movies were made and marketed. You had horror films, you had war films, you had musicals, and so on. But although we can point to similar genres in different eras of cinema, the approaches to the films within the genres can be quite different. Because filmmakers play the conventions and iconography, genres seldom remain unchanged for very long. Also, of course, society changes. Social mores change. At the end of the 60s, the production code was dissolved. And so all of a sudden, movies could feature violence, graphic violence, nudity, and profanity, stuff that the code had never allowed. So the elements of the genre films were quite different, even though in their broad outlines they were the same. And of course, the broader blanket genres, such as thrillers, romances, and comedies, never go out of style. But a comedy from the 1930s, such as It Happened One Night, is much different than a sex comedy from the 1980s, such as Porky's, or contemporary satire, such as the Borat films. And film genres did not arise out of vacuums. Just like every other element of film, such as narrative, cinematography, mise-en-scène, and sound, many film genres became established by borrowing conventions from other media. So melodrama and tragedy from plays and novels. The science fiction genre really arose in the late 19th century in the novels of Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. So those conventions were fairly well established before cinema was even invented. There's a long history of comedy and vaudeville. Of course, Shakespeare wrote comedies. Musicals come from opera and from dance and from recorded film. And then a little bit later on in the medium, comic books and graphic novels influenced films. Of course, today they're the most influential, at least in Hollywood cinema. And yet the film medium always imposes its own distinctive qualities and circumstances on an adopted genre. Most cinema genres and subgenres become established when one film achieves success and is widely imitated. Hollywood makes films that are already successful. They always have. So after several films that resemble one another appear, people begin to compare and group them, and then they become subgenres of their own. Recent examples could include blaxploitation from the 1970s, slasher films and teen comedies from the 1980s, gross-out comedies and indie films from the 1990s, torture porn from the 2000s, right? And of course now, comic book movies are the most popular genre probably for the last 20 years or so. Typically, genres do not remain constantly successful. Rather, they rise and fall in popularity. And the result is a phenomenon known as cycles. A cycle is a batch of genre films that enjoys intense popularity and influence over a distinct period. And cycles often occur when a successful film produces a burst of imitations. So some examples of cycles would be disaster films in the 70s, teen movies, slasher movies, and buddy cop movies in the 80s, urban black theme films in the early 1990s, and of course comic book movies today, although as we discussed, it seems like the cycle of comic book movies is here to stay. Rather than dying out, genres usually pass out of fashion for a time, only to return in updated form. So the sword and sandal epic, popular in the 1960s, returned with Gladiator. Science fiction, popular in the 1950s, came back with Star Wars and was very popular throughout the 80s. And the Western seems to briefly come back about every 10 years since its mid-century heyday. One genre that hasn't really come back all the way since its heyday in the 1940s and 50s was the musical. Although we still get musicals and sometimes they're very popular, we don't normally see more than a couple made every few years. And of course, the genre may also change by mixing its conventions with those of another genre. So Alien is famous for mixing science fiction and horror, and often gets credit for sort of mashing up that genre in a way that was very influential. But the reality is, sci-fi horror was a staple long before that in the 1950s. Many sci-fi movies of the 50s were also horror movies about creatures and monsters from outer space, or that were created as a result of radiation or something like that. What Alien did specifically was combine sci-fi with the haunted house genre. And that's why it felt so fresh. And then, of course, the teen movie and the musical, Hairspray is an example, sci-fi and comedy, and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy or Sleeper, Westerns and comic book in Logan, and we could also consider The Dark Knight. One of the reasons why The Dark Knight was so popular when it came out in 2008 was because Christopher Nolan took the very specific genre tropes of a contemporary Michael Mann style crime movie like Heat and fashioned them around the comic book Batman movie to give an entirely fresh aesthetic. And once the genre is launched, there seems to be no fixed pattern of development. We might expect that the earliest forms in the genre are the purest, the ones that stick to the most basic genre conventions. But the reality is that genre mixing can and did take place very early. And so this example of Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, right? The mashup of the comedy and the horror. In some cases, genres influence and mix with each other across cultures. And one famous example is the Japanese samurai drama and the Western. So Akira Kurosawa, who made The Seven Samurai, was very influenced by American Westerns and American movies in general. And when The Seven Samurai became an international success, American movies were influenced by it, including the American remake, The Magnificent Seven. And then in the 90s, American movies were very influenced by Hong Kong action movies. So a movie like Hard Boiled was very, very influential on The Matrix. And in Star Wars, for example, both the samurai movie and the Western were influences. So was The Wizard of Oz. The journey story with the robot and the Wookiee-like creature as the lion, right? And then, of course, Flash Gordon, the space opera, the action, the swashbuckling. So a movie like Star Wars is a mashup of all these different genres and in turn has influenced many other films and genres in the years since.